Welcome back. I'm so glad you're joining us today because we're looking at something that literally flips our whole understanding of global crisis management right on its head. We're talking about a futuristic paradigm shift in disaster response called the Earth First Initiative. If you've ever watched the news after a massive catastrophe and thought, come on, there's got to be a more permanent, efficient way to handle this, well, you hit the nail on the head. And you're absolutely going to love what we're unpacking today. Think about what happens when a major disaster strikes right now. We default to legacy reactive relief. We fly in thousands of temporary tents, we burn through millions of gallons of diesel fuel, and we set up infrastructure that basically starts falling apart the second the aid organizations pack up and leave. It's just a giant Band-Aid, right? But the Earth First Initiative, it proposes something radically different. Permanent terraforming. Instead of just dropping off pallets of bottled water and taking off, this system deploys biological nodes and self-sustaining infrastructure to essentially cure the disaster zone from the ground up. It's a total shift from temporary survival to permanent, sovereign recovery.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for the explainer today. We'll kick things off by defining exactly what the Earth First Initiative actually is. Then we'll meet the support fleet, which is just incredible. To see it all in action, we'll run through a real-world simulation of a glacial collapse in Nepal. After that, we'll track the ticking clock of their rapid staging protocol. And finally, we'll break down the massive economics in what I like to call the billion-dollar shift.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the Earth First Initiative.
So what exactly is it? Well, the Earth First Initiative is a totally new method for coastal to inland infrastructure deployment. Instead of relying on super vulnerable supply chains and your standard shipping containers, it uses biogrown magno-hydrodynamic, or MHD vessels. The core philosophy here is pretty simple but profound. Before we even think about terraforming other planets, we really need to figure out how to effectively terraform our own, Earth first. The ultimate goal is maximum efficiency, literally turning devastated disaster zones into state-of-the-art permanent infrastructure networks.
Now, to actually pull this off, you need hardware that's unlike anything out on the water today. Let's move to Section 2 and meet the support fleet.
We are talking about a highly specialized fleet of massive 380-foot biogrown vessels. Honestly, it's like a sci-fi movie come to life. Leading the charge is the flagship, the SS Lorentz Horizon. This beast houses the Master Tactical Command Hub, Doppler radar, and a full flight deck to coordinate the whole shebang. And right alongside it are 3 sister ships, each with completely wild payloads. First, you've got an ice infrastructure ship rigged with cooling towers and subterranean freezing manifolds that literally regulate microclimates and pull water right out of the air. Then, you have 2 debris-clearing ships loaded with electric earth movers and conveyor belts to recycle rubble right there on site. And my personal favorite, a mycelium housing ship equipped with biocomposite spray vats to actually grow living biological home shell modules directly in the disaster zone. I mean, how cool is that?
But these giant ships don't do it all alone. They actually tow 4 low-drag daughter node barges behind them. These barges carry the immediate granular infrastructure needed on the ground. We're talking 20 vertical axis wind turbine towers for instant power and water processing, mesh communication masts to get local networks back online immediately, electric bikes for getting around the rubble, and even bulk moringa powder and polyculture stock to kickstart high-density nutrition and reboot the local agriculture. It's basically a civilization starter kit in a box.
It all sounds totally mind-blowing on paper, right? But how does it actually play out in a real crisis? Let's ground this in Section 3 with a disaster recovery simulation in Nepal.
We're looking at a simulation based on the devastating August 2026 glacial collapse along Nepal's Bodakoshi and Trishuli River corridors. This massive, high-energy debris flow completely wiped out the region's rigid concrete barrages, which, by the way, really exposes how fatally vulnerable our traditional, inflexible infrastructure is to extreme weather events. Now, the stakes here are incredibly high because Nepal is landlocked. The disaster zone is roughly 600 to 900 kilometers away from the nearest ocean seaports. Trying to get aid up there using legacy methods over totally destroyed mountain roads? Yeah, nearly impossible.
So how does the Earth First fleet actually solve a logistical nightmare like this? They use what's called a multi-vector deployment. Step 1 is port staging. The main fleet docks down at Kolkata in the Bay of Bengal and sets up real-time communication links. Step 2 is riverine transit. Those shallow draft towed barges we talked about, they detach and travel hundreds of kilometers up the Ganges River basin to set up inland staging hubs. And then step 3 is the final push. Since the mountain passes and highways are completely washed out, they initiate an aerial lift. They basically set up continuous material supply loops, flying right into the damaged gorges using VTOL cargo drones.
Now, what's really fascinating is the specialized aircraft they use for that final aerial leap. For the super heavy payloads, they deploy a wing of 6 heavy-lift cargo hybrid airships. And listen, these aren't just your standard blimps. They're built with biocomposite frames and solar hybrid skins. But the real game changer? They're vertical crane winches. They can literally hover over a totally destroyed, completely inaccessible mountain gorge and flawlessly drop 60 tons of terraforming equipment directly onto the site. They completely bypass the need for intact roads or bridges.
Once that payload hits the dirt, the clock starts ticking. Let's move to Section 4 and check out the rapid staging protocol.
This entire terraforming transformation happens in an incredibly aggressive 48-hour window. In Phase 1, so that's the first 12 hours, they established a beachhead and run immediate reconnaissance. Then, from hours 12 to 24, Phase 2 kicks in. They anchor the hydronic systems and ice cores to stabilize the environment and secure fresh water. Moving into Phase 3, between hours 24 and 36, they fire up those mycelium vats we mentioned, rapidly cultivating and inoculating living biological shelters. And finally, by hour 48 in Phase 4, the entire site undergoes an autonomous network sync. So literally in just 2 days, a chaotic disaster zone is completely transformed into a highly organized, self-sufficient technological node.
So what does it take to actually build and run an operation this massive? Let's slow things down a bit and look at Section 5, the billion-dollar shift.
Building this turnkey global response fleet from scratch requires some pretty significant capital expenditure, or CapEx. You've got $146 million for the flagship SS Lorentz Horizon, $408 million for the 3 specialized sister vessels, $270 million for the hybrid airships, and tens of millions more for the barges, payloads, and landside hubs. When you tally up all that hardware, you are looking at a total build cost of around $912 million.
Now, when you add in the first year of operational expenses, the total year 1 commitment hits $967 million. I just want you to pause for a second and think about that massive figure. It's just shy of $1 billion. At first glance, that sounds like an astronomically high price tag, right? But we really have to ask ourselves, is $1 billion actually too high a price to establish permanent infrastructure that guarantees endless medicine, food, power, and water?
Well, the data actually illustrates a totally different reality. That $967 million total investment for the Earth First Fleet is entirely dwarfed by the staggering $10 to $64 billion that legacy reactive relief consumes for just one single major disaster. We are literally burning tens of billions of dollars on temporary aid right now. Tents that rip, plastic water bottles that just become toxic waste, emergency grants that eventually dry up. Compared to all that waste, a one-time billion-dollar investment for a reusable, permanent fleet, that's an absolute bargain. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that this investment fundamentally flips the entire economic model. Legacy capital allocation is completely consumed. It relies heavily on foreign supply lines and leaves the affected region totally dependent. But the Earth First allocation, it anchors permanent, autonomous nodes. By installing things like mycelium housing, wind power microgrids, and polyculture basins, it generates continuous resources right there on site. It doesn't just provide temporary relief, it creates true economic sovereignty for the people living there long after the disaster has passed. Which brings us to the ultimate question we really need to be asking ourselves as we look at the future of global infrastructure and disaster response. If we have the technology to deploy permanent, self-sustaining biological nodes anywhere on Earth, why rebuild the fragile, vulnerable past when we can terraform a resilient future? Think about that for a minute. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible initiative. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.